Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 118th video in our Master Series and the 4th video in our group processing. So I really hope that you understood what, if you went back and watched those videos that I told you to go watch, and I really hope that made it really clear about saturation and noise being added into your production. It's a very difficult thing to teach because you really need to experiment with it to really understand what it's doing. And, understand that for the most part, it's very light and very minuscule, so that it's just adding a little bit of warmth or melding things together, gluing things together, and blending things together a little bit. But it's really a really delicate job to do it well. Whereas sometimes in the old times, you just turn up a fader a little bit or turn up a compressor a little bit that did it a little bit, where this work is a little bit more delicate doing it that way. But you can come out with stuff sounding more like you want it and tailored to whatever your production is by using different plugins and different noise files and things like that, that you have every analog console on the world at your disposal, and any piece of outboard gear, whatever kind of saturations or noise that might have been added, right at your fingertips. And it just takes some patience on your part to do a good job of it. So I really hope you can keep that in mind. Now, when we get into the next thing, we're going to be talking about doing analog console emulation plugins, which can be a difficult thing. The first thing that problem we run into here is that the way console shapers work sometimes they work by your faders being turned up to a certain degree to cause certain things to happen with this. So you have to put this on at the beginning of the mix before you start mixing for it to have the desired effect that you're looking for. So they design sometimes that they are going to turn your whole DAW into emulating an analog console as you work. So you have to act like you're working through an analog console, which, most people working in software DAWs aren't used to doing that. And nowadays, a lot of people they can't afford those kind of desks and don't work with them any way, shape, or form. And the new ones that are coming out that they work with don't do all that stuff to the kind of the degree that these plugins are trying to emulate. So it's a very difficult thing to know whether to tell you to use them or not. The biggest thing that they're going to do, if you decide you really like these, then spend the money on buying a few of them and really research them to find out what's going on, because they're going to have different types of drive, saturations and noise and distortions into it, and noise. Different types of noise and different ones are going to be added into it. And sometimes it can be depending on how you use your faders and your DAW and other things that are going to affect how that thing operates, rather than you turning this up to here and going, I want that much. It doesn't work that way. It's turned up to there, and then it depends on how much you turn up your fader that causes this to start adding more and more of something into it. So you really need to research them to understand that. And crosstalk's a huge thing. Crosstalk is a great thing, and if I'm using an analog console shaper, this is normally what I'm looking for, because what this does, I've got my saturation bus doing what we talked about, and I've got my reverberation bus at the end of processing that's doing some of that blending and melding, and gluing things together some. And this is great. This is like having an overhead also. Does that make sense? Because basically what this does to some point, what this does is it allows bleed from the tracks to bleed into each other. So what this is going to cause is a little bit of a blending effect. The answer here is you would think that concept is faulty. Well, it's not. The concept, you would think, well, that doesn't make no sense. If I turn up the guitar and I turn up the bass, then I've got them turned up. And if I put crosstalk on that, what is the point of that? That's like a track in the middle that's going to be guitar bass, or what? I mean, what is that? Yes, to some point. But the problem is when you use this kind of a plug-in, that it helps to blend them together a little bit. So you do end up with something like a third track that's those two blended ghostly. Does that make sense? Like a ghost track that's those two combined. Does that make sense? So basically, you end up like with this ghost track that is the whole mix combined that is bleeding into each other. This effect can can blend things together. So, I mean, it's really debatable what any one of them might be doing, so it can make it very difficult to tell you exactly what that algorithm is doing on this particular console shaper or this console emulation plugin. So it can be, because they don't want to tell you exactly what it's doing, because then you would copy it, in some other way, or you'd buy a different, does that make sense? So they're not going to send you the algorithm or whatever it's doing. I mean, there's almost no chance of that happening. So it's really impossible to say exactly what it's doing. So in circuitry, I can tear a piece of outboard gear and I can tell you exactly what it's doing. On this, it's really hard to break this open and tell you what it's doing. I'm not exactly sure sometimes. So, the concept here is this is going to do a couple different things. Now, first of all, you have to take things into consideration I've talked about. And on top of it, that, it doing these types of things can add this effect. So now if you really like that effect, that I recommend going to here, because I do it from here for the most part, except for the crosstalk. So the crosstalk and letting it bleed through in certain areas, this is a cool thing to help blend things together. Because like I said, it like adds this ghost track that's the mix, bleeding into each other. Does that make sense? That basically acts kind of like an overhead. That you've got this overhead microphone somewhere that, it's not really in some certain place, like an overhead microphone is, but it's letting them all bleed together, kind of like an overhead microphone. Does that make sense? Then it creates this ghost track that you kind of blend in to whatever's happening. So it's a very unique effect that can affect your mix, depending on how much you like that or not. See, I've gotten to the point now that I work pretty clean. And a lot of these things I try to steer clear of, because I'm like, I don't even know what that's doing to my production, bro. And it's like, but sometimes once you understand kind of what it's doing, that you can, in some productions, I'll check it out. It's on my checklist to go through, and I'll bring it up in there. I'm like, yeah. Is it doing that? Is it bringing it in there? Yeah. That's pretty cool effect. Back off. Come into it again. Go back and see what it's affecting and the other things. So the console shaper, bus that I use a lot of times if I'm really wanting to emulate a console in particular. I'll buy it. I'll use a different one for whatever, effect that I want from whatever different console that I might be trying to emulate. But sometimes it can add a little bit of flavor also. So the whole concept of this bus is you really need to understand what a console shaper is, what a console emulation plugin does, and what all things it can do to your production, and whether that or not that's a good idea or not. And sometimes you have to work with them from the very beginning of a production for them to have the desired effect that they were designed to. So you have to kind of take that into consideration. Now, just like always remember, if I don't say something, that if you decide to use it, you remember that 3 steps forward, 1 step back. So then you're going back to the beginning. You're going back and listening to those individual tracks and those individual buses, to see if you might need to do any work there. Coming up to here, on the entire mix, does that mean you need to work off that? Going back to that saturation bus and the things you did there, do I need to work there? Back to there. Now do I need to adjust that? And keep rolling like that. The more you roll like that, the better your stuff will come, because you won't just go, okay, I'm done. Okay, I'm done. Okay, I'm done. You're really going to be thinking about, now that I've done that might affect some other work I've done. Take that 3 steps forward, 1 step back. And really remember to A/B back and forth, bypass things and listen to things really well. And you will hopefully come out with a really good sounding track. Again, a lot of this kind of stuff is really difficult to visualize. So using your visualization tools, this analog console emulation plugin thing might really be difficult to visualize what's happening. You might be able to visualize trailing harmonics and things like that happening, but it's going to be more of an ear thing. You're going to really have to get used to using your headphones, trusting your monitors, walking away for a little bit, coming back, getting some fresh ears, and coming back and going, okay, now what happened there? What did that now? Turn it off, A-B it back and forth with it on and off, with it on and off, with it on and off, and seeing what's going on, walking away and listening to it again, because most of the time it's very, very delicate work, and it's very minuscule and very finite. It's not, it's kind of hard to perceive. And when, a lot of the guys back in the day using certain console shapers or certain, outboard gear, any of this stuff that we were doing here besides like vinyl emulation or something like that, that they got really attuned to listen to something and then going, yeah, crank up my compressor a little bit. It added just a little bit of saturation to that. Oh yeah, that kind of blended things together and good to go. Yeah, all right, off we go. Does that make sense? Or I went to one of my faders and said, I'm cranking this up a little bit. I'm gonna let it start. I'm gonna let it go in the red just a little bit. Yeah, shh. All right, that's adding some saturation. I like that. Good, off to go. So you have to remember that a lot of those guys, it wasn't really rocket scientists a lot of times, that they learned that stuff did that, and it really wasn't them going back through and being so, audio engineer like we've been trying to talk about here about what's going on, because this is audio engineering, where that was music production, and they got really used to doing that. No offense, because I know they're all audio engineers, so I don't want them all calling me, and cutting my power line off, because, they are, but, it's a different way of going about it, because their way was fairly simple, and they knew they got used to using this console or this outboard gear that added just a little bit of saturation that they really liked, and they only had so many choices to go with, because of money or personal taste or whatever. A lot of times it was just about money. Nowadays, I've seen some guys, they have every piece of outboard gear you can imagine, but you can only have so many desks in your studio. You know what I'm saying? But you can get 10 or 12 studios if you want. I don't have that kind of money, so maybe you do. And so, these really work together. And those are the things you're really trying to do. And, whenever we get into this, like the console shaper, you really need to read about these, because these can do some cool things. But, we were trying to get some drive and saturation, and when we were doing the saturation, and we were trying to add some noise in there. The only thing we really were missing is this crosstalk. So it is really a great thing that can add a different dimension to what you're trying to do. And when I try to explain to you how I see it, so you can understand that you really need to experiment with it and listen to what it's doing to your production. And it might be doing it a little bit differently with different plugins, which, can be one of those investment things. Okay, so now we're talking about an investment in your studio of buying things, but you can most of the time download things and try them out and experiment with them before you buy them. So basically, we've gone through that, 3 steps forward, 1 step back process again. If you decide to use this, that you go back through that process like I talked about in the first video when we were talking about saturation, and go through that process again, and go through all that to the back to the head top and come back through it to make sure that, you don't have to adjust other things, because normally that kind of process is what's going to make your production shine, because then you're going to go back and catch things. You're going to go, oh, now that I did that, now I go back and fuss with that, because now it's changed a little bit, and now I need to readjust that. So just like we talked about earlier, that it's a huge concept to get in your head that will really make you become a good mixing engineer, because most of the time this processing is part of you being a good mixing engineer, and will make it to the point to where when you send your stuff to a mastering engineer, if you need to, he's going to be like, I don't even have to fuss with your stuff, bro. All I got to do is get it ready for formatting. Yeah, dude, that's what you want to hear. So anyway, that should basically conclude it with analog emulation things. And just remember, what I've talked about, and it's a pretty simple concept. Remember, these two really work closely together, so if you're using them both, just to really keep that in mind, that they're basically going to be working together. And you might use a console shaper, and you might augment it by some things like a noise file, or a saturation plugin or something like that, that's going to change it a little bit. So keep that in mind also. Those can actually be one tool working together to accomplish a unique type of noise saturation and crossbleed effect that you're looking for in your production, which is going to take experimentation on your part and experience. So peace, hope, love. I hope you enjoyed this video on analog console emulation plugins, and I'll see you in the next video.